Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 5, and this lesson, we are going to create our class library for our models. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We'll do so by opening up Visual Studio. Here I have Visual Studio 2019 that I'm using. We've switched over from 2017 to 2019 as this course progressed. So if it's a little new to you, don't worry. It's pretty much the same as it used to be. It's just reskinned and made more powerful. So if you don't have 2019, you have 2017, it's pretty close. You're fine. You don't have to upgrade if you don't want to, but the upgrade is free. All right, so we're going to create a new project. So right down here to the right, create new project. And we have a whole bunch of different options here. First of all, the recent project templates. If you do the same thing over and over again, like class libraries right there, .NET Framework, that's what we'll be using. But you can also select the language you want and the project type you want. And then from there, in library, there's library. And then from there, you can pick the one you want. Now we're using a class library because that's where we want to put our code, most of our code that's not console specific. So we have a few options here: .NET Standard, .NET Framework, .NET Core, which I scrolled a little too far there. There's .NET Core. And then we have WPF Custom Control Library, WPF User Control Library, WCF Service, and Syndication Service Library. Okay, the one you want is .NET Framework. We will be covering .NET Core in this series, but not yet. I want to get you a good foundation, and that means not going all over the place. And so we're going to get a good foundation in .NET Framework, and then just see how to move over to .NET Core. Because it really is just tweaks once you understand the .NET Framework. Okay, so .NET Framework, make sure it says that. If it says something different, you will get a different experience. Hit next, and we're going to give it a name and a solution name. I'm going to call this Battleship Light Library. I like calling it library because then I know this is a class library. And we're going to call this, the solution name, Battleship Light App. That way it's got a different name that encompasses everything that is Battleship Light. We use .NET Framework 4.7.2. That sounds good. And we hit create. And once this is done, it will give us just a class library. A little big there. There we go. So remember, class libraries, we delete class 1. And it says, are you sure? Yep, we're sure. Let me start over. And the reason I do that is we could rename that class. If we rename it in the file, then we have to also remember to rename, if we rename it on the right-hand side, let's just kind of undo that. I'm going to add class 1 back in real quick, just to kind of demonstrate this. So if I rename class 1 over here to my class, like so, it still says class 1 over here. And that's problematic. Now you can do control dot and say rename file to myclass.cs, which is great. That's wonderful. But you have to remember to do that. And if you're not careful, you can get some things out of sync. And you can also come over here and rename it. So if I named it instead my model, it's going to pop up a dialog box that says, do you want to also rename my class? You have to say yes on this in order for it to rename this my class to my model. If you say no, it does nothing. So you have to come over here and say, well, it's actually my model. So instead of messing around and possibly causing an issue, just deleting it just gets rid of it. You can start over fresh the way you want it to. So I am going to add a new class. Now, I could put these classes into folders. I don't have to. I think I'm going to just to kind of show you what those folders will do. So you can organize your solution by folders, and that's a good thing for organizational purposes. So new folder, let's call this models. Because really all we're going to do in this lesson is put in our data. This is what we are, what we designed in the D step of the Wood framework, which is just two models, player info and grid spot. If you have those notes from before, that's where we're going to basically just put those right in from our notes. Now we're going to put it into the models folder just so you can see how it'd probably organize a larger application. This is a small application. We don't really need to for this size application because we'll probably only have 3 or 4 classes total in this class library. But having this folder structure in place allows you to grow if you want to go down that path. So if I right click on models and say add class, and let's add the player info model. And I put model at the end because it indicates this holds data. And the first thing I'm going to do is make it public, like we do with all classes. Now notice here we have Battleship Light Library for the namespace dot models. So it has added the folder name as part of the namespace. So that gives us some organization even inside of our code. So when I reference this player info model, I'm going to reference it as Battleship Light Library dot models dot player info model. Now we can add a using statement up at the top that makes that not necessary to have that full long path. And we'll do that, but just know that's the full path now, which organizes it better in our IntelliSense. Okay, so inside of here, we need to add a couple of things, but first, I think we need to add the other model. So let's add another model, class called grid spot model. And the reason I wanted to add this one, let's make it public, is because this class is used in the player info model. So let's add the properties here first. So prop, tab twice, string, we're going to say spot letter, and then prop int spot number. Okay, so grid spot is like A5 or D3. We talked about that before. So this is going to be, in the D3, it'd be D, and this would be 3. And then we're going to have a status. Now, I could make this a string status, or I can make it an enum. We haven't covered enums yet, but I think this is a good time to cover enums because it seems to make more sense to make it an enum. So what is an enum? Well, let's just say, for instance, we use an integer for our status. And we could say, well, let's put in comments here, 0 equals empty, 1 equals ship, meaning there's a ship there, 2 equals miss, 3 equals hit. So if it's one of the shot grids, then actually not ship, it's sunk. So if it's empty, then we have, it's hard to visualize, put it on paper. So let's put it on paper. So go to the player info. We've got first the user's name. User's name. And then we have a list of grid spot model. And this is the ship locations. And then we have another list of grid spot model, which is the shot grid. Okay, so these 5 entries here, which we have 5 of them, are the 5 places that a ship will be. So when you place a ship, the status is going to be empty at first, probably, or maybe instead of sunk, instead of empty, maybe it's placed. So the ship is placed there. Or let's just say ship. And then we have a status, probably let's say 4 equals sunk. So we place a ship in the ship location, but when our opponent hits that ship, we're going to mark that ship as sunk. Okay, so that's the ship locations. But in the shot grid, we have grid spot model, that's going to be all the spots. So A1 through 5, B1 through 5, C1 through 5, D1 through 5, and E1 through 5. They're all going to live in this shot grid. And so each one of those will be empty at first, which is the starting default value. But then if we make a shot in one of those spots, we're either going to mark it as a miss or a hit. So this status will change based upon which type of grid spot it is. Now, it used to be we'd do something like this, where we'd say, okay, we've got an integer, but this is what 0 means, this is what 1 means. And then in our code, we have to remember, okay, what was 2 again? Was it miss, or was it hit, or was it sunk, or was it ship or empty? What was it? We get confused. And so we might sometimes put a different value there. Well, that's where enums come in, where they say, you know what, we're going to create an integer, but it's going to limit you to certain ones, and we're going to allow you to name those entries, and we'll force you to only use those entries. Okay, so let's create one to see. In the Battleship Light library itself, not even the models, I don't think. Well, let's put it in models. This is one of those debates of where you put it. We're going to create a class file, but it's not a class. So I call it enums. And what I do, and this is up to you if you want to follow this pattern or not, and I'm going to paste it in right here. All we need to do is list them, and we do it with Pascal case, meaning the first letter of every word is capitalized. So empty, comma. We just go to the next line on this. So ship, miss, hit, sunk. There are my 5 enum values. We don't give it a number. We could. Notice that if I hover over it, it says grid spot status dot empty equals 0. ship equals 1, miss equals 2, hit 3 and sunk 4, that's because it just starts at 0 and counts up. But we don't typically override that. We could, but we don't typically. So if you want to override that, you could say equals 5, like so. And now I'd override empty to be 5. Now ship is 6, miss is 7, hit is 8, and so on. And you can even go in here and mess around with the orders. Now you got ship equals 6, miss is 67, now hit is 68. But the reality is, for the most part, we don't change these. The one time you want to change these is if you actually want the underlying value to have meaning. So, for example, when you're talking about audio files, there are different, I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm not an audiophile guy, but there's different like values like 2800 or 5900. It's the wave rate or something like that. I'm not sure. But what you can do is label those as to what the name of that is, but then give it the value of the number that it's associated with. So sometimes it does make sense, but for the most part, don't worry about it, because it's not about the number anymore. It's about the actual name. And I'll show you why. Go to grid spot model, and instead of status, we're going to put instead of int for status, we're going to say grid spot status. So I use that as a type instead of an integer. Now when I say equals, it says grid spot status in IntelliSense. If I hit tab and hit dot, it now gives me my 5 options. Well, by default, I want every spot to be empty. So there we go. So now this model has a status for every spot, for this specific spot, and by default, that status is empty. So that's really it for our class library creation. We've done a few interesting things in here. First, I've used a folder so you can have the namespace include that folder name. We have used enum and seen how to do that. We can add more enums if we wanted to, by just coming down here and saying public enum and adding the next one in, which I don't anticipate us needing more, but we have that option if you want to. We've also seen that we can assign an initial value to a property by just saying equals and then the value. These are auto properties, don't forget. So it's very easy to assign initial value that way. And we've now gone through our entire data set that we designed. So we designed this group of data, 2 items actually, player info and grid spot, when we went through the D step of the Wood framework. And we just basically took what we did in those steps and just put it into code. We didn't have to think overly much about what data needs to go in here and making sure we have all the data and all the rest. We were able to just type it from our notes, which made it really easy, really quick. Okay? Now, one question that I get a lot, especially from newer developers that haven't really used class libraries a lot, is why would we build this in a class library? Because, for example, I can't test this by hitting start. If I hit start, it's going to give me an error. Let's actually pop that error up real quick just to show you. The error you get is this. It says a project with an output type of class library cannot be started directly. And that's because you can't run a class library. It doesn't have a user interface. So why do we create these class libraries when it seems to make things a little more difficult? And the reason why is because we want code reusability. So we won't take advantage of it necessarily in this project, but you could down the road if this was a real application. So if this is a real application, and I put as much of my code as possible in this library, and I have a console front end. Down the road, when you learn about WinForm applications, where you've got buttons and you've got visualization that way, you can come back to this project and go, you know what? I want to upgrade this to use WinForms instead of the console. And instead of rewriting all of your code, you only have to rewrite the console portion, not any of this code, which right now is just 2 models. We'll have some more logic in here before we're done, and that's in a future video. But even so, we don't have to rewrite that code. We can use the same library with a different user interface. And it's not just desktop. And Battleship Light Library.pdb. So a class library creates a DLL, which is a dynamic link library, I believe is what it stands for. But essentially, it's a class library. And the PDB helps us with debugging remotely. So that's what we create when we build this project. But you can't run a DLL. So we're going to do that in the next lesson when we look at the front end of this project with the console app. Okay? But before we do, we have a pro tip, which is to separate your non-user interface code into a class library, because it means you can reuse your code more easily. Okay? It makes it much easier to change out that user interface, which does happen quite a bit actually. Because as new technologies come out, for example, we used to have mostly desktop applications in corporations. Well, with the advent of the web, it makes it much easier to deploy your application because you're deploying it once to a web server. So companies would switch over to web forms. Well, that was great for a while, and that's a user interface change. And if they had designed their application right, which most of them didn't, it felt like, but if they design it right, it makes it very easy to change out your WinForm application for a web form. And then MVC comes along and makes things more object-oriented and better for scalability and all the rest. And so now you change it again. Well, .NET Core comes out. And what do? So just keeping that user interface moving is how you keep up with technology, even if the core of your code doesn't change as often. So those class libraries, really important. So make sure you get to know them, love them, put as much of your code in there as possible, as long as the code is not user interface specific. Okay? So we'll talk more about that in an upcoming video. All right, your homework. Create a console project in your solution. So the solution we just created, add a console project, and add in the methods the console will need. Okay? Now, we haven't wired it up yet, so we'll have more logic going into the class library, but just try and identify what are the methods I'm going to need in my console project and just scaffold them out, meaning just put the the methods, don't put code in them yet. Okay, so once you're done that, then come on back for the next lesson.